mind if I talk about something slightly odd for a little while? I've been playing through Pacific Drive recently, and it's a really good game. I'm having a great time with it, it's got a strong art style, it's dripping with atmosphere, and I like listening to the characters' banter. The core game loop of expeditions and resource management is something I've long hypothesized I'd like, and lamented that I didn't enjoy it so much in Chernobylite, so it's satisfying to see that as a game structure it does work, though that does raise the question of what didn't work for me about Chernobylite. In any case, the thing which I like most about Pacific Drive is probably not particularly surprising, but it's the car. I really like the car in Pacific Drive. From the way you can look around the cabin and individually interact with all the different switches and levers, to the way you don't access the car inventory by pressing tab while in the car, but rather go and open the boot, or trunk, if you're wrong, and interact with the storage in the back. You have to carry a spare tyre over to replace it, or pull a panel off and carry it away because it's damaged. To the greatest extent a non-VR game can, Pacific Drive makes you get hands-on with your in-game equipment. It all feels so tactile. In his book The Art of Game Design, Jesse Schell writes of actions, quote, "Actions are the verbs of game mechanics. There are two perspectives on actions, or put it another way, two ways to answer the question, what can the players do? The first kind of actions are operative actions. These are simply the base actions that a player can take. The second kind of actions are resultant actions. They have to do with how the player is using operative actions to achieve a goal." End quote. So the idea here is that you've got your verbs of gameplay, your operative actions, which are usually mapped directly to your button inputs. Crouching, running, sneaking, jumping, shooting, crafting, that sort of stuff. That's all your operative actions. Resultant actions are simply the strategies that emerge from players combining these actions together. Take Hitman, for example. If I crouch down to hide in a hedge, throw a coin to get a guard's attention, then knock him out, steal his shirt, and stuff him in a box, I've just set a trap in order to get a new disguise so that I can get further into the level. Setting a trap is a resultant action of using the operative actions at my disposal. The point of this is that, and this is especially true in systems-driven games like Hitman or Dishonored, a large amount of emergent complexity and resultant actions can be created with the addition of a single operative verb. If Dishonored allowed you to disguise yourself as a guardsman, the entire structure of the mechanics of that game would change massively with only the addition of one new operative action. This essay isn't too concerned with resultant actions as strategy, but rather in talking more about adding complexity to what at first seemed to be operant actions, like driving. I live in rural England. My friends all live variously in other bits of rural England, so as a result, I drive. I quite like driving. I found it stressful when I was first learning, but now I'm a lot more comfortable behind the wheel, and it's honestly quite relaxing for me, though not at rush hour. There's a sense of unbridled freedom and loneliness that comes from driving alone, that's coupled with a feeling of control and skill that comes from driving well in a manual transmission car. In a game like Grand Theft Auto, driving is a thing that you do. You press F or triangle to get into a car, and then you're controlling that car. You use WASD or the left analog stick to move the car, and attention has been given to making the actual movement feel like a car instinctively sort of should feel, but it's not all that complicated. Just to interject here for a second, I am absolutely not trying to levy this as a criticism against GTA. I firmly believe this is the correct decision for those games to make. Driving fast in GTA is a thing that's supposed to sort of fade into the background. It just makes for a good point of comparison for games that are using similar mechanics, but implementing them differently in order to create a different effect. Pacific Drive doesn't necessarily use its component pieces to make the specific act of driving more immersive, though it does have you turn the key in the ignition and manually switch the car between park and drive, lest it roll away from you down a hill, but mostly it uses these systems to make your car feel like a real presence in the game world. This ratty old station wagon is at the absolute core of Pacific Drive, and so including all these different ways of interacting with it, which involve you having to look or move around it and interacting with all the different panels, switches and buttons, gives it a real sense of physicality in the game space. It also makes the act of repairing and modifying your car more substantial than it would otherwise be. Can you imagine a version of Pacific Drive where instead of walking around Oppie's shop, you just repaired and replaced all the components from a menu? It would still be fundamentally the same game, you would still have all the crafting and inventory management, you'd still be working on the same car, but it wouldn't be the same. This game world physicality, this tactility, is the invisible source that makes games like Pacific Drive feel just that bit better. It makes it easier to get into character, to feel the vibes of the place you're in, and Pacific Drive absolutely thrives on its vibes. This is because it emphasises the player character's physicality in the world. Iron Lung is another great example of this. You have to move your character around the world space and move things with your hands, and you see it happen in front of you. Sea of Thieves breaks down ship sailing in a similar way to working on the car in Pacific Drive. In this case, it stems from the requirement to make sailing a cooperative task, but the overall effect is the same. Instead of controlling the ship like you do in Assassin's Creed Black Flag, you have to actually run around the deck of the ship, manipulating each piece independently. You have to hoist the anchor, adjust the length and angle of the sails, and then turn the wheel until you're sailing in just the right direction. Sea of Thieves doesn't even limit this to the ships. Moving treasure around emphasises the player's physicality by making you carry each item one by one. Until recently you couldn't even sprint with smaller items for whatever reason. Even the core game equipment adheres to this simple set of rules. If you have a tool, in order to use it, you have to pull it out of your pockets, hold it in your hands, and use the left or right mouse button to use its functions. It's a simple system, and adhered to consistently, but even small things like that help enhance the feeling of being a character in the world. You don't just have a telescope button that you toggle on and off, you don't just have a compass icon in the corner of your screen, you don't quick heal by holding down a hotkey. Each of these items behaves the same way, and it gives the game source. This effect isn't limited to just being source on top of what could be a simple game menu or HUD element. Sometimes the addition of compound verbs and player physicality ends up shaping a core mechanic. RedShift is a tiny little game that's free on itch.io. It was made by one guy called Mab in about 2 weeks for a game jam, and contains my absolute favourite implementation of a manual transmission that I have ever seen. In RedShift, you have to change gears, but it's not just right bumper to upshift, left bumper to downshift. Instead, the left bumper engages the clutch, and you use the right stick to shift the gear stick into the correct position, then you rip the clutch and get moving. This isn't exactly faithful to the realities of driving a manual transmission. There's no balancing the clutch. If you downshift from 5th to 2nd at 120 miles an hour, the engine doesn't rip itself apart, and if you try to go from 1st to 5th, the engine doesn't stall out. But that's not the point. This is a game about driving fast, and doing so skillfully. It creates that same rhythm of driving well in a manual transmission car that I mentioned earlier that's so very satisfying if you're into that sort of thing. RedShift is a great example of taking a mechanic that's often overlooked, even in more simulational driving games like Euro Truck Sim, and turning it into a mechanic. This makes accelerating and slowing down fun in its own right, as you get into this rhythmic flow of bouncing up through the gears. It even allows for additional depth. You can downshift to accelerate harder after slowing down on a turn, or even downshift multiple steps in one go to simulate engine braking and slow down as you enter. All of this is to say that when I talk about tactile interaction, what I'm really talking about are breaking down the operant actions of your game into their base components. Basically, taking one game action and compounding it into many game actions as a way of creating a sense of physicality and immersion in your game, as well as adding an extra layer of indescribable source, or even mechanical challenge for the players to master. Vehicles have been my main example of this so far, but let's move away from them, as I want to demonstrate that this can be included in many different ways. Take, for example, the act of smoking a pipe. Say I was designing a Dishonored-style immersive sim set in an industrial revolution London, and I wanted to include smoking a pipe as a method of recovering health, or mana, or what have you. I want my game loops to separate combat and recovery, because this is a slow-paced game. I don't want players bunny-hopping around the combat arena puffing back on a pipe. I want them to be smoking it thoughtfully as they stroll through the streets on the way to their next destination. Now, I could arbitrarily limit you from healing when you're in combat, or I could mechanically disincentivize it. Let's say that instead of having a heal hotkey on the keyboard, the pipe is an inventory item, just like anything else. Over the course of the game, you can buy or collect various different flavours of pipe tobacco that have different effects, kind of like the different grass types in Demon's Souls or the various plant colours in the Far Cry series. Now, when the player wants to heal, they're going to equip their pipe, using some kind of radial menu or whatever interface you like. Then, again, using that same radial menu, they are going to select the type of tobacco they want to use, played here by Earl Grey tea, and then hold down a key to hold the pipe in their mouth while they fill it, get a lighter, and light the pipe. Obviously the actual specifics of this would need some tweaking in order to actually feel good and be fun still, but doing it this way encourages the majority of your players to only use this system when they're not in combat or otherwise under time pressure, and the few players who do get comfortable enough with your systems and controls to be able to huff back a fistful of that good cushion alcohol in the middle of combat will be playing at a noticeably higher level of skill. This is a desirable state for your game to be in, as it encourages players to master your systems and lends itself well to a better sense of flow. This can also lead to players discussing how to to get better at healing in combat, leading to theory crafting and helping your game organically develop a sense of community, in theory at least. This also meets the criteria for tactile game objects because, like Sea of Thieves, each of your items is an equipable object which has its own associated actions, rather than being an abstract menu item which you use with a hotkey. There's one big, obvious issue with this entire process, and that's that implementing each of these mechanics takes time and effort. Having to make individual animations for each of the individual interactions, as well as making meshes and models and sound effects and particle effects, all takes time. However, in a lot of cases, these things would have been done anyway. Like, meshes can be scaled and reused. Particle effects especially are quite often reused. Let's come back to the car from Pacific Drive. A lot of the animations are pretty rudimentary, just wiggling, with some post-process effects, particle effects, and sound effects. Or, in some cases, it actually just removes the object from your hands, spawns it in front of you as a physics object, and adds a launch impulse to it. The player's brain bridges the gap between the mesh the player is holding and the object in the game's world. The meshes themselves need to exist regardless, as these aren't just inventory items, they're physical objects in world space which can be picked up and thrown around. But there are also technical problems to solve in implementing this sort of system. I've built compound objects in Unreal Engine before, and in that engine at least, any interactive component of a compound object needs to be an actor in and of itself, which means there's a performance cost greater than just some meshes and textures. So you need to be aware of turning off things like physics ticks if you don't want them enabled. There's also the hassle of figuring out how to tell the parent object that the generic child actor is actually a specific actor class so that you can call functions on it. If you're struggling with this, by the way, you can get the actor from the child actor component, and as long as the component type never changes, get a handle using a pure cast. It looks like this in Visual Script. Implementation in C++ is basically the same. Just, you'll figure it out. Finally, this isn't a catch-all hack to making your game more immersive. It's a tool in the game development toolbox, but it's one that I am quite partial to, and one that's worth considering next time you're designing your mechanics. It's most important to consider how this impacts your other mechanics and systems as well. The pipe-smoking healing system I outlined in the previous section is, I think at least, great if you want a game which encourages players to slow down and think strategically about when they engage with healing and combat. However, if the game you're making is supposed to be fast-paced and action-oriented, you're probably better off using the Far Cry technique of giving the player a button to press which plays a short animation, uses an item from their abstract inventory, and restores their health, as this will lend itself better to the flow of your game. This is completely unrelated to the thesis of the video, but it's something I did want to talk about in relation to Pacific Drive, and I didn't know where else to pop it in the essay. Something else I absolutely adore about the game is that the car develops quirks, which are random behaviours that you have to troubleshoot and repair. One of the ones I got was that the headlights dimmed whenever I turned left, which made driving at night quite difficult. The thing I really love this is that it perfectly captures the nature and character of driving around an old banger. Take my Mini, for example. Whenever I start driving, she beeps. She always does it without fail. I have never worked out why this happens, I couldn't find any info online about it, and at this point I choose to believe it just means she's excited to see me. Anyway, for anyone out there who's designing your own games, this is something to think on. Next time you play something, look at how certain mechanics are implemented and how they feel to use. Think about why they might have been implemented that way and how you can break down your operative actions to reinforce the tone of your game and make your core mechanics more engaging and skillful. Lastly, but most certainly not leastly, I have been working on a fixed camera survival horror game, which you should be able to wishlist on Steam in the next week or so. If the link isn't in the description yet, there'll be an announcement video when it does come out. It's still in early development, so it'll be a while yet until the game is ready, but if you like things like Resident Evil and Alien Isolation, maybe give it a wishlist when it's available. It'd mean a lot. There are going to be videos coming out a bit more regularly from now on, as I'm going to try and make semi-regular devlogs talking about the work I'm doing on this project and how far along it is in development. Hopefully this way you'll all be able to see what you're getting into. In the meantime, I hope something in this video has been useful or interesting for you, and thank you very much for watching.